I didn't believe in omens not until I found the house. It was a Victorian relic standing isolated at the very edge of the city, a place where the concrete streets met dense woods. It was an architectural marvel at first glance, tall with grand windows, a porch that wrapped around the front like a welcoming arm. But as I stared at it, something gnawed at me, a quiet unease that I couldn't shake. Still, the price was right and it was everything I wanted: privacy, space, and most importantly, escape from the suffocating noise of the city center. The real estate agent had assured me it was a steal. Last owner left in a hurry, she said, but wouldn't give details. Nothing you should worry about. I brushed it off. People moved for all sorts of reasons. Maybe it was the location, far enough from neighbors to feel alone, but close enough to the city to still be practical. Maybe it was the age, the upkeep, or some other ordinary reason. It didn't matter, I was sold. The first night I arrived late, just before dusk. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. There was a chill in the air despite it being late summer, and the long driveway seemed to stretch endlessly into the gathering gloom as I approached the house. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the towering structure. For a moment, I hesitated, the sight of it far more intimidating than I remembered. The windows, though large, were black, like empty sockets staring at me. A wind stirred the surrounding trees, making their branches scrape together in a sound that reminded me of whispers. Still, I shook the feeling off. It was just an old house. Inside, the house felt colder than it should have been. The air had a stale, musty quality, as if it hadn't been lived in for much longer than the realtor claimed. I turned on the lights, but they flickered faintly, casting weak shadows that danced along the high walls. As I walked through the house, my footsteps echoed on the wooden floors. It was eerily quiet, unnaturally so. Every room I entered felt off, as if the walls were hiding some long-forgotten secret. The kitchen was old-fashioned, with an outdated stove and a heavy wooden table in the middle. I set my bags down, intending to unpack later, and headed upstairs to explore the second floor. The creaking under my feet grew louder, more pronounced with each step. At the top of the stairs was a long hallway, lined with old portraits, their eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. The last room on the right was the master bedroom. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see inside. I stepped forward, pushing it open. The room was vast, with a large bed in the center, covered in an old, moth-eaten quilt. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. The room didn't feel empty. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against my ears. I was being watched. But by what? By whom? I glanced around quickly, nothing but the old furniture, a wardrobe in the corner, and dust-coated windows. It took every ounce of willpower to enter the room fully. As I approached the bed, the air seemed to thicken, like the very atmosphere was trying to push me back. I turned and caught my reflection in the old mirror hanging on the wall. My face looked pale, more so than usual. But that wasn't what made my heart lurch into my throat. Behind me, just over my shoulder, was a shadow. Not mine, something else. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My eyes darted to the corners, the closet, the door. Nothing. Just my nerves, I told myself. I was exhausted from the move. But the feeling lingered, crawling under my skin, whispering that something was wrong with this place. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard it, the first strange sound. A soft scraping like nails on wood. It was coming from inside the walls. I sat up in bed, my ears straining to catch the noise again. It was faint, barely audible, but constant. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Mice, I thought, hoping to rationalize it. Just mice in the walls. But then it stopped suddenly, the way things do when they're aware they're being listened to. I held my breath, waiting for it to start again, but all I could hear was the hammering of my own pulse. Just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard something else. A slow creak, like the floorboards groaning under the weight of someone walking. This time it wasn't in the walls. It was in the hallway just outside my bedroom door. I didn't move. I couldn't. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped right outside the door. I waited, the silence stretching on, suffocating. When nothing happened, I forced myself to get up, my legs shaking as I approached the door. I swung it open, fully expecting to see someone, something. The hallway was empty. But that's when I noticed it, the cold. A freezing draft seemed to be coming from the end of the hall, where earlier everything had been shut tight. The last door on the left, a room I hadn't yet explored, was now slightly open. Just enough for a sliver of darkness to escape. It felt like an invitation. An invitation I wasn't sure I should accept. But something was drawing me closer, something I couldn't explain. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the slightly open door at the end of the corridor. My heart was racing, a steady, frantic beat that echoed in my ears. Every rational part of me screamed to turn back, to lock myself in the bedroom and forget about whatever it was that had stirred the air in this house. But I couldn't. Something gnawed at my insides, pulling me closer, pushing me toward that door. I forced my feet to move, slow, careful steps toward the dark sliver of space beyond the door. With every step, the house seemed to close in on me, the walls tightening, the air thickening like a living thing. My breath came in shallow gasps, but I couldn't stop. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, fingers brushing the cold brass, hesitating. I pushed it open. The room was small and empty, save for an old rocking chair near the window. The chair was facing away from me toward the street, its worn wooden legs still, not a sign of movement. For a moment I stood in the doorway listening. The house had fallen into an unnatural silence again, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. I stepped inside, cautiously, my eyes scanning every corner of the room. It was plain, like a guest room that hadn't seen use in years. A thick layer of dust coated the floor, untouched. The window was slightly ajar, letting in a faint draft, but that didn't explain the footsteps I had heard. There was no one here, no sign of anything out of place. Yet the sense of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I turned toward the door, ready to leave this room behind, when I saw it. The rocking chair, just a subtle shift, a tiny creak of its wooden joints, as though someone had gently pushed it. I stared at it, my heart thudding loudly in my chest, half expecting the chair to start moving on its own. But it remained still, quiet, a motionless silhouette against the dim light from the window. I backed out of the room, quickly closing the door behind me, the cold air from the hallway brushing against my skin. My hands were shaking. This house, it wasn't right. I should have left, I knew that. I should have packed my things and walked out the door that very moment. But something kept me there, something beyond my understanding. I wasn't going to let fear get the better of me, not yet. Determined to shake the uneasy feeling, I decided to explore the rest of the house. Maybe I could find an explanation, something that would settle my nerves. I made my way through the remaining rooms, the guest bedrooms, the study, the basement. Every room had the same heavy air, as if time had forgotten it existed, untouched by the world outside. The basement was the worst. The stairs were narrow and steep, leading down into a cavern of darkness. I had to fumble for a light switch, my fingers brushing cobwebs as I descended. When the light finally flickered on, it revealed a space that was bare except for old, rusted tools hanging from the walls and a few rotting crates in the corner. The air down there was damp, and a faint, foul smell lingered as if something had decayed long ago and never been properly removed. I didn't linger. The chill in the basement was too much, the sense of being deep underground too oppressive. As I climbed back up the stairs, the wooden steps groaned under my weight, each creak echoing in the empty space behind me. I glanced back once, feeling a pair of eyes on my back, but of course no one was there. By the time I had explored the entire house, exhaustion had set in. My nerves were frayed, every creak and gust of wind making me jump. But nothing concrete had revealed itself. No ghosts, no intruders, no signs of anything truly dangerous. Just a house, old and creaky, playing tricks on my mind. That's what I told myself as I headed back to the bedroom, hoping to sleep off the fear that had clung to me all evening. The bed felt unnervingly cold when I slipped under the covers, the sheets stiff with age. I turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness, and stared at the ceiling. My eyes darted around the shadows looking for something, anything, out of place. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep, haunted by vague nightmares of empty corridors and creaking footsteps that led nowhere. It must have been hours later when I awoke suddenly, the feeling of being watched pulling me from the depths of sleep. My heart immediately began to pound as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. At first I saw nothing unusual. The room was as it had been when I'd fallen asleep, silent, still, shrouded in shadows. But something was different. There was a presence, one that I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. In the doorway. A figure, pale, almost translucent, barely visible in the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. It stood there, motionless, just watching me. My breath caught in my throat, panic surging through me. I couldn't make out any features, only the faint outline of a human form, white and shadowy, like it was barely there, a mirage just at the edge of my vision. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. My body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, but my mind was screaming at me to do something, anything. The figure didn't move, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was real. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. It was there watching me. A sudden jolt of terror shot through my body, and I sprang up from the bed, my breath ragged and my hands trembling. The figure remained in the doorway, unmoving, its presence growing more solid with every passing second. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced for an escape, and there was only one option that didn't involve crossing paths with that thing. The window. Without thinking, I lunged toward it, throwing the curtains aside and yanking it open. Cold night air rushed in, sharp and biting against my skin. I could feel the figure behind me, its eyes, or whatever it had, burning into my back. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. In one swift motion, I clambered onto the windowsill, the edge of the roof just a short drop away. With no time to think, I leaped. The impact jarred my legs as I landed on the roof, the shingles slicked beneath my feet. My balance faltered and I slipped, sliding down toward the edge. My fingers scrambled for a hold, gripping the cold edge of the gutter just in time to stop myself from falling. Below, the ground looked impossibly far, but I had no choice. I swung my legs over and with a deep breath, I let go. I hit the ground hard, the shock of the fall shooting up my legs. Pain flared in my ankle, but I didn't have time to focus on it. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting up toward the window. The figure was gone. I stood there, panting, my chest heaving in the frigid air, the house looming over me like a predator. I didn't go far. I limped to the treeline a few yards away, my heart still hammering in my chest. The ground beneath me was damp and the wind carried a biting chill, but it was better than being inside that house. I leaned against a tree, eyes fixed on the house, trying to catch any sign of movement. Nothing. The window I had jumped from was dark, the figure gone. I sat there, shivering, waiting for dawn. The minutes stretched into hours, every small noise in the night, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch, made me flinch. My mind raced with questions. What was that thing? Why was it in the house? And, most importantly, what the hell had I gotten myself into? There was no going back inside until the sun was up. That much was clear. I stayed huddled there, watching, feeling the cold seep into my bones. Every so often, I glanced back at the house, expecting to see the pale figure again, but it never reappeared. The night stretched on, endless and suffocating, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sky began to lighten. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, the fear that had gripped me all night began to loosen its hold. The house, once a terrifying monolith, looked almost normal in the morning light, just an old, empty building. But I wasn't fooled. I knew what I had seen. Whatever was in there was real, and I wasn't about to stick around any longer than I had to. My body ached as I stood, my ankle still throbbing from the fall, but I had to go back inside. My things were in there, my phone, my wallet, my car keys. I couldn't leave without them. Besides, I needed to put an end to this. I wasn't going to live in a house where something was watching me while I slept. The walk back to the front door felt like a journey of 1,000 miles. Every step was hesitant, my muscles tense as if the house itself might come alive and swallow me whole. But nothing happened. The door was still unlocked from the night before. I pushed it open slowly, the old hinges creaking in protest. The inside was just as I had left it, empty, still, unnaturally quiet. No sign of the figure, no trace of anything out of the ordinary. I moved quickly, trying not to let my fear get the better of me. I gathered my things from the kitchen and living room, stuffing them into my backpack with shaking hands. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the doorway again, but the house remained eerily silent. I had one last stop, the bedroom upstairs. My suitcase and some clothes were still in there, and despite every instinct screaming at me to leave them behind, I couldn't. I couldn't walk away from this house without everything I had brought in.
The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed back up, each step sending a shiver down my spine. The hallway was just as I remembered, long, dark, and cold, with the door at the end of the corridor standing slightly ajar. I hurried into the bedroom, keeping my eyes away from that open door. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that something could still be watching me from beyond the threshold. I threw my clothes into the suitcase, not bothering to fold them, my heart pounding faster with each passing second. The air in the room felt heavier than before, like something was pressing down on me. As I zipped up the suitcase, I dared a glance toward the doorway. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight, waiting for me to turn my back. I grabbed the suitcase and bolted from the room, not looking back. I didn't breathe again until I was at the front door, the suitcase bumping against my leg as I fumbled with the handle. Outside, the sun had fully risen, and the early morning light bathed the yard in a golden glow. It felt absurd, almost surreal, standing there with the house behind me, looking so ordinary in the daylight. I took one last look at it, the old porch, the tall windows, the overgrown grass, and then turned away. This house wasn't for me. It had been a mistake, a horrible mistake. As I drove away, the house shrank in my rearview mirror until it was nothing but a speck in the distance. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. It didn't feel real, but I knew it was. That figure in the doorway, the cold, the oppressive silence. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't deny it either. I stopped at the nearest cafe, a small place off the highway, to catch my breath. I sat there with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring blankly out the window. The warmth of the cup did little to soothe the chill that still lingered in my bones. I needed to get rid of that house fast. I pulled out my phone and snapped a quick picture of the house from my gallery. With a deep breath, I logged into one of the online real estate platforms and began writing a listing. I kept it brief, no need to explain the real reason I was selling. I knew it wouldn't last long on the market anyway. Charming Victorian home, secluded location, ideal for those seeking privacy. I included the basics, the square footage, the number of bedrooms, the price, marked down of course, and hit post. A notification popped up almost immediately. It was live. I stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a strange sense of relief. The house wasn't my problem anymore. Soon, someone else would come along, eager to own a piece of history, charmed by its isolation, unaware of what lay inside. I told myself it wasn't my fault. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? But as I sat there, finishing my coffee, that same cold dread began to creep back into my mind. The figure, the open door, the strange presence, what if it wasn't done with me yet? I shook the thought off, determined to put it behind me. The house was no longer mine. I was leaving that nightmare behind.